Hello and welcome to 28storms.com. This is your latest tropical weather update for June 4th, 2011. This is the latest service map from the National Hurricane Center, and as you can see in the western Gulf of Mexico, we still have the remnant low pressure of 93L Invest now moving into northern Mexico and southern Texas, really not providing that much in the way of rainfall, unfortunately. But that's the last you hear about this system as it continues to move inland. In the meantime, we have a stronger area of low pressure still located just south of Jamaica, and as of the making of this surface plot, the National Hurricane Center has it currently listed at about 1,008 millibars, and it is currently stationary. This is also the latest highlighted area from the National Hurricane Center, and they currently think the system poses a 30% chance of possibly developing into a tropical cyclone within the next 48 hours, and that is a slight upgrade from this time yesterday when it was about 10 to 20% in code yellow. Here is the latest visible imagery for much of the Atlantic Basin. As you can see, 93L Invest is now finally pushing inland and no longer poses any threat whatsoever of possibly developing. And in the meantime, we have this persistent area of low pressure located in the central and western Caribbean. We've been watching this for almost the past week already, and it's been even longer than that since the model started showing the potential for any type of tropical development. And it looks like we're going to be continuing to keep a close watch on the western and especially northwest Caribbean over the next several days, possibly as much as the next 6 to 7 days, as it doesn't look like the storm is going to really move anywhere. So, as we can see, there is still currently a lot of wind shear, thus the reason why lots of convection continues to get pushed and shunted off toward the northeast, as we can see by this trailing end of convection. And the actual low pressure center is still located just to the south of Jamaica. We also now have zoomed in floater imagery since this has been designated 94L Invest, so the National Hurricane Center is taking a slightly closer look at things. That's the reason why we actually have this ability to zoom in a little bit further. Anyway, this is the low-level circulation just south of Jamaica. You can see a very broad area of rotation, and it's a bit exposed with not a whole lot of convection currently located over the center. Again, everything is just to the east, and that's not only due to some westerly wind shear, but there's also some dry air aloft, which we'll take a look at in just a minute. And here is the latest water vapor imagery. This will tell you where the driest air is in the mid to upper level layers of the atmosphere. And currently the Gulf of Mexico is actually bone dry in the mid to upper levels, and that's actually spreading into the northwest Caribbean a little bit. And a general rule of thumb is that if the wind shear is less than 10 to 15 knots, the dry air does not entrain so well into low-level circulations. But since we do have some moderate westerly shear still in place, some of that dry air apparently is getting funneled into that low-level circulation. And as long as that's the case, we're not going to see explosive development right near the center. Now, this is the latest morning 12Z sounding out of Kingston, Jamaica, and this shows the upper-level environment fairly well. As you can see, it's fairly moist between the mid-levels of the atmosphere and the surface between 500 and, of course, sea level pressure. But between 500 and 300 millibars, you see that significant drop-off in the dew point, and we have fairly large dew point depressions, which is differences between your dew point and surface temperature. And that's a really strong indicator that you have mid-level dry air being funneled in. And also, if you look at some of the wind vectors, as we go higher into the atmosphere, we start to get some northwest wind shear aloft, and that's also helping to funnel in this dry punch of dry air, which is certainly not that favorable for immediate tropical development. We can also see this on the latest precipitable water imagery. Yesterday we did have a tropical wave that came in from the eastern Caribbean, and that also helped fuel some of the added moisture that was coming into the central Caribbean. And you can also make out that low-level circulation toward the end of the frame near Jamaica. But as you can see, we also have that dry little funnel of air coming in over the northwest Caribbean. These are the latest ASCAT satellite-derived winds, and as we can see, the satellite passed over the Caribbean around mid-morning, and much of the circulation was actually cut off or not seen by the satellite very well. But you can see on the western front of it, we do see that cyclonic turning of the winds with the low-level circulation located about here with some northeast winds near the surface bending down toward the west just to the south of the circulation. So it's somewhat well defined, just really void of convection at the current moment. And of course we still have limited surface observations in this part of the world, but as you can see there is some broad low-level cyclonic turning situated just south of the island. This is the latest SIMS 850 millibar vorticity analysis, and that low-level vorticity is about exactly where we would expect it to be based on the latest satellite returns. This is the latest wind shear, and day by day the upper level ridging has become a little bit more and more evident over the central Caribbean, and we can see that a little bit better here. We have decreasing wind shear to the south. We still have that strong upper level trough axis just to the north, but that could actually become a bit more of a favorable pattern if we actually had enough room down here in the central Caribbean where this upper level trough would actually help to ventilate the storm by increasing the poleward outflow channel, but we're still a long ways away from that beginning to happen. Since this system has already been declared 94L INVEST, the tropical model suite from the National Hurricane Center is being run, but to be completely honest with you, several of these models really do not add much to our arsenal of forecast guidance because some of these models are really outdated. For example, the CLP5 is a climatological model, and it doesn't really take into account any of the current upper level forecasts, so it really doesn't have anything to go by except for history. And the BAM models really can't see or foresee the changes in the upper level pattern over the coming week, so they just go with the current pattern, and that's really not that reliable since the pattern is obviously always changing. Therefore, we'll continue to take a closer look at the dynamical model guidance, and we'll start off with the 12Z GFS. And as we run the sea level pressure forecast, the model simply keeps a broad area of low pressure to the south of Cuba throughout the period, and in fact it does start to show a slight northerly component to the forward motion, and it almost takes it into the Florida Keys by days 6 and 7. As we take a look at the 850 millibar vorticity pattern, we see that a little bit better with a nearly stationary motion for the first couple days, then preceded by our northward track towards southern Florida. This is the latest GFS shear forecast, and as I set this into motion, you will see that it's really not the most favorable for tropical development. It continues to show a very elongated west to east area of upper level ridging, but we also have that trough just to the north, and it really doesn't begin to retreat much at all because we still have some upper level low pressure located over northern Florida based on this run. But that's only if this model is correct. At this point, the latest Canadian CMC run is a model outlier. It strengthens the storm a bit more than any other, but not only that, it also takes it a bit too far north into the Bahamas, and based on the current pattern, that appears to be a bit unlikely. We can see why the Canadian model solution is occurring if we look at the 500 millibar forecast pattern. It currently keeps the troughing over the central and western Atlantic for the next 3 to 4 days, and if this storm in the Caribbean were to intensify fairly quickly over the next 2 to 3 days, it will have a greater chance of being picked up by that central Atlantic trough. This is the latest low-level steering, and as we can see, we still have a subtropical ridge over the southeast United States, but we still have dominant troughing near Bermuda, and as we look into the mid to upper level layers of the atmosphere, that trough becomes increasingly more prominent. Therefore, the reason that if this storm were to intensify too quickly, it will be quickly turned out to sea. But again, that's not the most likely solution, as it will likely remain weak over the next 2 to 3 days, and will more than likely become captured by the subtropical ridge, and thus a more westerly component will likely begin in the near future. This idea is supported by the latest 12Z run of the UK Met model. This is the current time. We have a 1009 millibar surface low initialized in the model, overlaid on top of the 500 millibar forecast pattern. We still see that subtropical ridging in place and the aforementioned trough over the central Atlantic. And as I advance this into day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, the weak area of low pressure that we've been monitoring ever so slowly begins to move more toward the west as the central Atlantic trough begins to lift out toward the northeast, while the subtropical ridge over the southeast remains anchored in place. And finally, by day 5, the low appears to be poised to move into the southeast Gulf of Mexico by days 6 and 7, as it looks like it's going to pass between Cuba and the Yucatan Peninsula, with the positioning of the ridge oriented from southeast to northwest along the U.S. East Coast. The UK Met forecast is also being supported by the latest 12Z ECMWF run. As we can see, this is the current time, 12Z, and as we advance this into 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours, by day 4 we finally start to see some movement off toward the west, although very slow. By day 5, it's now beginning to move more toward the Isle of Youth. This is by day 6. And just as the UK Met is advertising, we start to see more of a northward component in the medium range. This is day 7, and by days 8 through 10, we start to see some gradual northward movement along the Florida Peninsula. Of course, that's too far out to really be too concerned about, and it's fairly weak on this run. Not only that, but the models are probably going to change their solutions several times this far in advance. And so what we can expect over the next week or so is a very gradual movement toward the Isle of Youth between Cuba and the Yucatan Peninsula, with a far out track more than likely toward the southeast Gulf of Mexico. As to how strong this low pressure will be, it's very hard to say at this point, but we still cannot rule out a possible strengthening into a tropical depression or tropical storm over the next 5 to 6 days. Although at this point, I would say the chances are still a bit less than 50%, but the jury is still certainly out on that. So thanks again for checking out 28storms.com. Please check back again later this evening or tomorrow for another daily tropical update.